Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation about Ecojustice's legal challenge of Premier Jason Kenney's inquiry into so-called anti-Alberta activities. My name is Carolyn, and I work on the communications team here at Ecojustice, and I'm going to be helping to run this session. I'm joining this call from Vancouver, and I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that the land where I live and work is on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and that these nations have for millennia cared for and continue to care for this land and the surrounding waters that I am grateful to call home. I know folks are joining today probably from across the country and from other Indigenous territories, and I can see that people are still continuing to log on. And as they do, I want to take a moment to make sure everyone's comfortable using this webinar platform. If you've joined one of our conversations before, thanks for your patience, because you've heard this spiel before, but I just think it's helpful to make sure everybody is oriented. So on the screen, you'll see an image of the control panel. I'm just going to point out a few features, starting with what's called the grab tab, and it's that orange rectangle with an arrow inside of it. It'll be at the top left of your control panel, and when you click on that, it's going to minimize or expand the panel. So with that panel expanded, you'll see that you've got a couple audio options here for either computer audio or phone call. And when you click on the circle beside the audio option, it's going to immediately switch between the two. If you wanted to use your phone, we recommend you use your computer audio, but if you wanted to use your phone, this is where you would find instructions for calling in. And just note that there might be long distance charges that would apply there. And then I'll just finally talk about the question box where you can submit questions and comments at any point during today's conversation. We have set aside time at the end, but you can submit your questions at any point as they arise. And I'll just mention here that this question box doesn't function like a chat in that other attendees won't be able to see what you're submitting, and that's a limitation of this platform. So let's go ahead and test out the question box. I am curious to know where people are calling in from. We're talking today about a legal challenge that's happening in Alberta, but I imagine that this case is of interest to people outside the province as well. So if you want to just type that in, I can see that there's somebody who's having difficulty with the sound, and I will if you have technical problems, feel free to pop those questions in as well, and I will respond in the question box in just a moment. And yep, I do see we've got people calling in from across the country, Manitoba, Victoria, a lot of people from Toronto. I'm seeing folks from Calgary. Where else are people calling in from? Ottawa, yep, we've got people from coast to coast, it looks like. So thank you everyone for joining us. For those of you who are new to Ecojustice, I would like to just take a moment to tell you a little bit about us. Ecojustice's mission is to go to court and use the power of the law to defend nature, combat the climate crisis, and fight for a healthy environment for all. We are the only environmental law charity in Canada that takes on strategic public interest litigation and advocacy at the scale and scope that we do, so from coast to coast to coast. We work out of 5 offices across the country in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, and Halifax. And from these hubs, the Ecojustice team is on the ground, building relationships with the people we serve and fighting issues that matter in local communities, and then scoring legal victories that have far-reaching impacts. As you'll hear today, our legal challenge of the Kenney government's inquiry is a great example of what we do in terms of being a voice for the people. And I think this is a good point to maybe begin welcoming our panelists, starting with our moderator, my colleague, Melissa Gorey. So Melissa joined our, hey Melissa. joined our Alberta legal team in 2010, and her litigation work has focused on protections for at-risk species. These days, however, Melissa is our law reform manager. That means that together with Ecojustice's partners, she works to develop and implement law reform campaigns, including advocating for federal climate accountability legislation. And I'd like to welcome Devin Page, Ecojustice's Executive Director. Like Melissa, Devin spent his early years at Ecojustice channeling his love of wilderness into protecting Canada's endangered species. And as Executive Director, he's focused on enhancing Ecojustice's effectiveness by emphasizing litigation around key environmental and legal priorities. And then finally, I want to introduce David Kahn. So David joined Ecojustice fairly recently, toward the end of last year. And over the course of his career practicing Indigenous rights, constitutional and environmental litigation, David has become passionate about advocating for First Nations interests and environmental protection. And David is also the former leader of the Alberta Liberal Party. So welcome to all three of you. Melissa, I'm going to hand things over to you, and then I'll join you on the call a little bit later on.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Hi, everyone. I'm honored to be here to moderate the panel today. And before I dive into the questions, I wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge the land on which I stand. So I live and work on Treaty 6 territory. More specifically, I'm situated in Miskawachee, Waskagun, which means Beaver Hills House in Nehiyaw or Cree. This land has been a gathering place, a traveling route, and a home for many Indigenous peoples, including the Nehiyaw, the Tsuut'ina, the Niitsitapi, the Métis, the Nakota Sioux, the Haudenosaunee, the Dene Sulene, the Anishinaabe, and the Inuk. And these people have cared for this land since time immemorial to the present day. And in doing this land acknowledgement, I am reminded of the historical and ongoing impacts of colonialism and what it has taken from Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. I'm also reminded of the multitude of ways I have benefited from colonialism and am still complicit in supporting and upholding colonial systems and structures. Finally, I'm reminded that acknowledging the history of this land is not enough, that I need to be accountable for the actions of my ancestors and the ways I personally uphold colonial ways of being, knowing, and living. And so I'd like now to turn to my esteemed colleagues, David and Devin, and ask them some questions about the public inquiry. My first question is to both of you. So for many people joining the webinar today, you're likely familiar with the Alberta inquiry, but if you were approached by someone who has never heard of this process, how would you explain it to them in one sentence?
Right. I think the one sentence limitation was because I can't talk about this in one sentence. But before I answer, and then David will go next, let me also let folks know that I'm joining you from Vancouver, and my neighborhood is located in the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. All right, so this will be a sentence with a few conjunctions, so you'll have to bear with me. But the Alberta inquiry into anti-Albertan activities was born on the campaign trail, as I say, when Jason Kenney, using the technique maybe I hope he regrets now, borrowed a page from Donald Trump and tried to rally voters by characterizing there being a conspiracy by well-funded foreign individuals to fund Canadian charities primarily to landlock Alberta oil. And I suppose I wish we didn't have politics like that. It's a crass style that I sometimes think is un-Canadian, but whatever. That may well have been fine, but what Jason Kenney then did when he took power is to manifest that in a legally constituted public inquiry with the powers to compel people to appear and to potentially prejudice them, because it could find that what we think is lawful, legal, and even just solid Canadian value representing was adverse to the Alberta interest. Over to you, David.
Okay, so I'll jump in here. First of all, I want to thank Melissa for her comprehensive land acknowledgement, and I want to again point out that Ecojustice's Calgary office is located on at Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot word for the area where the Bow and Elbow rivers converge, and this is a sacred gathering place for them. And it's on the traditional ancestral territories of the Niitsitapi, which is the word for Blackfoot, the Anani Nakota, or Stony Nakotas First Nations, Tsuut'ina, and also for the Métis Nation of Region 3. And of course, we're on Treaty 7 lands here in Southern Alberta. And I just want to remind all of our listeners that we're all treaty people, so we all have a duty to uphold the promises that our government made with First Nations in these treaties. So in a sentence, I'll say, as a born and raised Albertan, to me, this inquiry itself is a very un-Albertan attack on the freedom of Albertans to think and speak independently, values Albertans really cherish and defend. And I'm going to cheat here and add one more sentence. I've said many times before that this inquiry is pure political theater, and no Canadian government should be supporting, never mind bankrolling, this kind of theater with public funds.
Excellent, thank you guys. Well, I was going to provide a bit additional context, but because you guys did more than one sentence, I don't have much to add in terms of providing a bit more background. But I'll just note that the inquiry was launched back in the summer of 2019, and it was part of the campaign promise that they were bringing, and they actually describe in the terms of reference to look into anti-Albertan energy campaigns, and that's how it's framed, and whether there is foreign funding being received by those anti-Albertan campaigns. And it was supposed to last 1 year and cost $2.5 million, but since then the process has ballooned, and we're now, in January 2021, a 1.5 year long timeline, and now a $3.5 million price tag. And while the terms of reference, when we first read them, it really, raised red flags for Ecojustice, and we knew right away that we had to get involved and that a legal challenge was required. And so now, after launching a lawsuit 4 months after the inquiry was created, we are now approaching the hearing next week. So if you don't mind, Devin, just expanding a little bit about, you said what the inquiry is, but why, from your perspective, is it important that Ecojustice be involved and challenge this inquiry?
Sure, and when in answering that question, I'll also tell people that Ecojustice is litigating on this in our own name. And I know we have lots of long-term supporters of Ecojustice, and you typically know that we work through the courts on behalf of clients. But we make the rare exception to act in our own name if the particular issue transcends, say, an interest of a particular environmental organization or a community or a First Nation or individuals. We represent them all. And in this case, the transcending issue was free speech and protecting the right of the public. In this case, ordinary Canadians or Canadian charities that want to talk about the pace and scope of oil and gas development in Alberta and the risk posed to us and our kids by climate change. We wanted to defend that interest and protect people from the public inquiry. So we decided to step in our name.
Yeah, and in a way it shows just how kind of unique and exceptional this circumstance is, that we just right from the get-go realized this was kind of an affront on democracy and the legal issues that were at play that stand, in our own name and challenge this inquiry, for sure.
Well, and let me, I was thinking, we had talked about this before, but I should just tell folks, I was in Ottawa on the day that Jason Kenney announced the inquiry, and my phone started ringing. And it was environmentalists, but also I took a call from a letter writer from Nova Scotia who'd written to the Alberta government complaining about the poor state of regulation of oil and gas, particularly was talking about oil sands expansion, who wanted my opinion about whether or not they would be prejudiced or jeopardized or attacked as a result of participating and characterized as anti-Albertan. So there were a lot of reasons that Ecojustice had to step in.
While we're trying to protect the climate, they're creating a climate of fear, right? Like where you say like a news reporter or average Albertans are starting to be afraid of what they can say and not say, right? So what specifically would you say that when the lawyers go into court next week, what are they going to be arguing in this case?
Three things. David, you'll get lots of time to talk later. So three things, which I'll summarize. First, that the government brought the inquiry for an improper political purpose, and that was primarily to further, an election boast, or well, I don't even know what you call it, but they brought it for an improper political purpose, and they manifested that in the terms of reference itself, which actually point to foreign conspiracies, and they're being studied in the United States. And that the process around the inquiry, which is the political statements of Jason Kenney, the missteps of the inquiry early on associated with the inquiry commissioner having donated to the justice minister and sole source contracts and all that sort of stuff, the circumstances of the inquiry being created, giving rise to reasonable apprehension that this is a biased process, that this is intended to result in a predetermined outcome, and that outcome would be that they prove the conspiracy that Jason Kenney has alleged, which is, Ecojustice and others are part of a conspiracy, again, to landlock Alberta oil. And then the third issue is that matters that they're considering don't fall under provincial jurisdiction. And this is one thing I think that a bee in Jason Kenney's bonnet that he carried from his days with Stephen Harper, and many of you will remember the Stephen Harper government, in particular Joe Oliver, writing the open letter to Canadians saying that environmental charities were enemy of Canada because we were averse in interest because we were fighting to protect Canada from climate change, and that the government then went after charities to try to pull their charitable status. Hopefully we thought those days were over. Now Jason Kenney is starting to say the same kind of thing. So we're arguing that the inquiry doesn't actually have jurisdiction to look into that side of things.
Yeah, it's a good point, right? That environmental organizations and nonprofits have been dealing with this kind of narrative for many years, like under the federal government, the Harper government, and the actions that were taken. And this is just kind of another step. And in this case, when you even have the phrase, Anti-Albertan campaigns in terms of reference in a legal document that is going to be used then to investigate what these activities are, it's like it just really highlights the years that this narrative kind of has developed, kind of really crystallizing in Alberta in this specific inquiry. It's a good context.
And for a while it worked. I mean, I think until Ecojustice brought the case, the community shut up. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to raise their head and be subject to the inquiry. And we'll talk more about this later, but I think as a result of Ecojustice's court case, we've largely neutralized that threat. Anyway.
So yeah, and I agree. And David, turning to you, because you've lived in Alberta, I think, your whole life, and you've obviously spent time in Alberta politics, and so you have an intimate knowledge of the political landscape here locally. So I'd be interested to hear what your view or take is on how public attitudes toward this inquiry has evolved over the last year and a half.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. This inquiry and also the $30 million a year war room, which Albertans have heard about, that was set up further to another political theatrical grandstand of Mr. Kenney to also attack people speaking out about environmental issues. They were both dreamed up, as Devin has talked about, on the campaign trail, and they're really meant to prey on Albertans' valid worries about the economy and the future of the province. But since they were officially created by Premier Kenney's government, they've both really developed into a farce for the Alberta public, and unfortunately for the wider world, unfortunately they've garnered international headlines, negative headlines for our province. So they've harmed our reputation globally, I think. And some of the examples of the problems that the inquiry has undergone are, as Melissa said, multiple extensions of time. I think we're at 3 now, and an increase in budget of $1 million. Cronyism and impropriety by the commissioner in working as a consultant for Denton's and using Denton's email, but giving a $1 million sole source legal contract to Denton's, where his son is a partner, and the justice minister was a partner. So these are issues that have really come to light and have concerned Albertans across the political spectrum.
Well, yeah, I think you did a good job of summarizing why last month Ecojustice put out a statement, and in it said, that Commissioner Allen has already demonstrated time and again that Albertans should not take his findings seriously, right? And as you say, there's been so many missteps and delays, and the issue with his son, there's just been so many of those kinds of things cropping up. So, again, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say about kind of how it feels like whatever the findings are, that there's no way that we can take them seriously based on what has happened to date already and how this inquiry has been structured.
Yeah, I mean, the way that Commissioner Allen has conducted himself, the way he structured the inquiry, the terms of reference, and the way he's managed public funds have really brought into question the whole inquiry and really brought into disrepute the whole process. And so, I think Albertans rightly have no confidence in the process and the conclusions it might come to. And so it's really, not only a waste of time and money, of public money, but it's also negatively hurt our standing, international standing, and it'll hurt our trading relationships when we have a government acting this way.
Yeah, definitely. And so back to Devin, we talked about how the report has been delayed multiple times already, and there's been the request for additional funds. And so what do you think you don't know for sure, but what can you surmise that based on the fact that there's additional requests for more time and more money, what does that tell you about how the inquiry process is going internally and what we can expect to see when this report is finally issued?
Oh, it's a good question. Of course, we read all the media on the inquiry, so folks may not have seen this, but one of the people that was interviewed as part of the secretive process of the inquiry met with Steve Allen about 8 months ago, and she said it was pretty clear he hadn't read the terms of reference. and one of the things Ecojustice has seen from the outset is that where typically a public inquiry would be, it would have judicial form and processes. It would have transparent consideration of the evidence, maybe the opportunity to test it through cross-examination, public hearings, the public would know what was filed. This one was held in secret. And the sense that we had early on was it didn't seem like the commissioner knew how to run an inquiry. So we sued and the terms of reference changed. We wrote about bias and secrecy and the terms of reference changed. We wrote about a lack of process and the commissioner set out rules. What is this latest thing? I think there's two things that drive this latest request for an extension at the 11th hour. One, the commissioner, someone might have finally let the commissioner know that he's legally obliged to give notice to people, individuals, whomever, that the inquiry will make an adverse finding against. And if people heard the media about the kind of Looney Tunes reports that were made public a couple of weeks ago, including one that named Greenpeace 85 times as part of this conspiracy, you would think there's a reasonable likelihood, and we believe it will happen, that this is prejudged, and the purpose is to kind of follow through with Jason Kenney's conspiracy theory and tar and feather the environmental movement. So if they're going to come out with something that frames us negatively, they have to give us notice for that. So they have to do that. And secondly, I think it's just poorly run. I think this tells us that this inquiry has not been well managed from day one. I think it lacks expertise related to the conduct of a proceeding like this. I don't know why the first thing they didn't do is look at inquiries across the country and go, there's best practices, let's try to implement them. I think this was designed for a predetermined outcome, which is a predetermined report. And all of a sudden, particularly as a result of our lawsuit, the commissioner realized, oh, I've got some legal obligations, and it all seems last minute. But you know what, maybe David has some thoughts. Like, things have gone on here that I have never seen before. So I actually can't explain the scope of missteps by the commission. I can't explain it. Any thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, I mean, I literally shake my head whenever new press comes out about this inquiry and about Mr. Allen's activities, because it's just, it's amazing that in 2021, a a government with a $55 billion budget and can set up an inquiry and task someone to run such a sideshow and to really just damage our reputation as a well-governed province. So it's and there's just been, you know, one after the other of problems. You know, I didn't mention earlier that Mr. Schweitzer, the former Justice Minister who recommended Mr. Allen to be the commissioner, he received a number of campaign donations to his UCP leadership campaign and to his campaign in the provincial general election. And Mr. Allen held a fundraiser for him, and so it's these kinds of improprieties that really bring disrepute to the whole process, and it's some of these reasons why we're alleging political bias.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting, like Devin said, about how, you know, a couple times they've amended the terms of reference because of either, you know, I think partially what we put forward in terms of our advocacy, and then the pressure put on in the media and from the public about this inquiry. But it was so bare bones to start, and it's anybody who knows anything about how an inquiry should be run, what due process, procedural fairness, any like basic principles of law and democracy would look at this on the face of it and say this does not even meet the bare bones of what is required. And especially then when you see that there's an indication of potentially naming organizations, they need to be given a chance to respond. They need to be able to speak to the issues. And so I think it's interesting that it's taken this long, though, for them to get to a place where now just announcing in the last week, okay, we're going to have some sort of a process over the next few months where we're actually potentially going to engage and not just do a behind the desk exercise. So it's really interesting to think about kind of the what the government might be thinking in terms of what can fly under the radar, what they're able to do without having to be accountable under the law. And it's part of the reason why organizations like ourselves, like why we exist, to ensure that the law is upheld and that governments can't just kind of slide things under and not uphold the law. So, but yeah, it's interesting that it's taken this long and this many amendments to get to a place where we're maybe going to see some sort of process where organizations that may be named in the report are going to be able to speak to the issue. So
yeah, and further to that, Mr. Allen, you know, abandoned the original terms of the reference, required him to decide whether there was any allegations that were by environmental groups that were unfairly attacking the oil and gas industry, and he's abandoned that part of his mandate because he realized it would be impossible to adjudicate those kinds of claims with the timeline and the budget he has to actually decide on a basis of facts whether the allegations of environmental groups are factual or not.
Well, you know, I just have to add one more thing. I know we got to roll along, but if folks may have seen that Energy Minister Sonia Savage had to respond, media asked her to respond to the extension of the inquiry, and where a year ago it was, there is this foreign funded conspiracy. Now it's maybe there's a foreign funded conspiracy. So I mean, yeah, I just have not seen anything like this before. Anyway, okay, Melissa, back to you.
And I've been working in Alberta doing environmental law for a decade, and I haven't seen anything like this before either. So, and on that point about kind of the conspiracy theory or the narrative, I find that it is really premised on the idea that organizations like Ecojustice, we get our money from outside sources, and that these funds are provided intentionally so that we can, you know, bring downfall to the Alberta economy. And we know that that's not accurate. But I think it'd be helpful if you could kind of unpack that a little bit, Devin, and speak to why that is a false narrative, in particular, demystifying where Ecojustice's funding actually comes from.
Sure. So Ecojustice is a charity, and the vast majority, over 90% of our funding, comes from individual Canadians. And that's public. I mean, we're charity, and you can go on CRA's website if you want to look up the information. But I think the thing that irks me most is the notion that somehow we'd become puppets of, I don't know, of this foreign cabal. The real story, and no one's ever asked it, is in 2006, before I was executive director, we were involved in a court case regarding expansion of Alberta's oil sands, and it was the Curl oil sands application. And I was co-counsel with another lawyer. And the more we learned, particularly about the oil sands, but about Alberta's oil and gas industry, the more we were concerned, and particularly about the oil sands. Even then, the evidence that was unrefuted before the court was that it was one of the most harmful projects in Canada in terms of its impact on biodiversity, i.e. the footprint, as we just mowed down habitat. We basically bladed it away, including lakes, rivers, and streams. And it was even then the largest single point source of carbon emissions in the country. And we said we had to do something about that. And I was part of a team that started to look for money. But what that really meant is we had to establish a presence in Alberta. And we wanted to do that because that's where the issue was. And so Ecojustice had developed an organizational strategic plan, prioritized the issue, and prioritized the region. And the most environmentally harmful issue was the oil sands, and the region was Alberta. So we started to fundraise for an Alberta office based on having identified priorities. And that funding eventually became some of this funding that I guess they're trying to track back to the issue of a conspiracy. One of the things that most of our donors know, but if you don't know, Ecojustice determines what the legal priorities are independent of the ability to fundraise. And we have tried to grow our revenue for the purpose of addressing those environmental challenges that has nothing to do with the appetite of a particular donor. And we tell donors that, and we've lost funding as a result of that. It has to be a priority environmental legal issue before we act. That's the story.
And I can back you up because I've been involved in some of those long strategic planning sessions and other discussions internally where, you know, it's the organization and develops the priorities, and we decide what makes most sense from a legal and environmental impact. Like you say, like the oil sands, it's just from greenhouse gas emissions, what it is, right? So yeah, I can back you up on the fact that we are motivated by what we identify as an organization as priorities. Thanks for demystifying that. And I think it's really, sometimes people are surprised to learn that we are funded so primarily by individual donors. And so, yeah, we're getting
20,000 Canadians at the moment.
So we're getting close to the time where we want to take questions from folks that are on this webinar, but I wanted to maybe float a few more if we have time. We've been talking about the public inquiry, and obviously there's a lot of kind of negativity that kind of circles the air when you think about this issue and the kind of the feelings that it evokes in terms of being in Alberta and what it can feel like doing this work, and just generally what the Kenney government has been doing, and the negative decline in policy and law when it comes to environmental protection and social justice issues. But I'd like to give David an opportunity maybe to give us a bit of a more uplifting view and a bit of silver lining about kind of what are some of the things that you see in Alberta in terms of the movements, the campaigns, what individuals and community groups are doing that give you hope for Alberta and our ability to, you know, create a respectful relationship with the rest of the natural world.
Yeah, I've been so impressed and further motivated by the outcry of Albertans from across the political spectrum and from all over the province, urban and rural, regarding the Alberta government's dead of night, Friday night of a long weekend rescission of the Lougheed era 1976 coal policy, as we call it. You know, with zero consultation with anyone beyond the coal lobby and the coal corporation, which would allow strip mining in the Rocky Mountains and headwaters that was previously protected by Premier Lougheed's foresight, what is that, 35 years ago? So, or 45 years ago. I won't be doing some math on, I shouldn't be doing math on the fly here. But so I've been really, really impressed by that and how engaged Albertans are on that. Similarly, the Alberta government had plans to privatize and sell off provincial parks and campgrounds, many of which I'll note, I don't think coincidentally happen to be in the areas that have been newly leased to the coal companies for their strip mining activities. So, and that caused a reversal of sorts by the Alberta government. Now we have to see how that plays out and make sure that's actually a reversal, but they claim that they're no longer pursuing those plans. So I'm really impressed with that, and I think things like this have really caused the Alberta public to lose trust in their government. And another good news story I want to highlight is the reintroduction of plains bison into Banff National Park after an absence of over a century. They were a real keystone species in the park, and you know, in 2007 they introduced 16 bison, and we now have a herd of over 45 roaming free in a very backcountry area of the northern part of the park. So that's another great news story for biodiversity and protection of nature.
Yeah, that is a really positive piece. And like I can just say, having again done this work for a while, it's really great to see, even though there's a lot of negative policies being implemented, it's really great to see how Albertans are really standing up and like going for a walk and seeing signs on the neighbors' lawns that, you know, about protecting the parks. And, you know, I think maybe the government has taken things to such an extent that it's really reminding Albertans about the passion that they have for this land and the water and the places that we like to live in and connect with. So I think that's a really positive piece to see the communities coming together and advocating for change and not taking any more from this government.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in, and Carolyn will put my recent blog post about our work in Alberta in the chat box. If you want to learn more about what we're doing on the ground here in Alberta and other issues, I encourage you to give that a read.
Absolutely, and the Alberta office is very busy, and we're excited to have David on board now. There's just so many issues, right? Like Kenney government is keeping us busy. So, and I think we have time for just one more question from me before we turn it over to the webinar audience. So turning it back to the inquiry, I want to ask you, Devin, so at the end of this hearing next week, what would you envision a win looking like in terms of what would this actually change on the ground if we were to be successful in this case?
Right, yeah, so to remind folks, we're in court in Alberta Court of Queen's Bench on February 11th and 12th. So a win, well, the basic remedy that we're asking for is that the court quash the inquiry, which basically would render it null. They'd have to start over again. And if we win, I think the key outcome of this is we successfully push back on a government that would seek to abuse its power. I mean, although we've been saying that this is an unusual situation, it is an unusual situation in Canada, but it's happened in the past. If we're successful, I think Jason Kenney will think twice about doing this kind of thing again. And I think he's the kind of guy that would do it. So I think that's success. But I think it sends a message nationally as well to governments that would purport to manipulate legal processes to go after everyday Canadians. They'll think twice before doing that, and particularly if it's on an environmental issue.
Great, thanks for that, Devin. So we have quite a few questions coming through in the chat box. So I am going to pull up one here, which I see a familiar name. It will be familiar to you as well. It's asking about Vivian Krause. So this question is from Peter, and he's asking, will your legal effort here involve the role of Vivian Krause?
Well, I'll answer that one. And so people might be going, who's Vivian Krause? And I have to say, I often say that myself. Vivian Krause is, I think she was most recently a BC resident who styled herself as just a concerned Canadian citizen who wanted to find out the story about basically this conspiracy. And she's the one that in particular has developed what she says is evidence of the foreign funded conspiracy that Canadian charities are manifesting. Now, if folks want to explore more on that, a good place to go is the National Observer had an article by Sandy Garacino, a former prosecutor who looked actually at the evidence and has done a takedown. And you know, part of this thing that makes it kind of loony from our perspective was captured by the Globe and Mail in an editorial this weekend where, you know, I have mixed feelings about this, but basically they said, how could little old Ecojustice basically stop a $90 billion oil and gas industry? It is a bit loony. So what they're basically saying that charities whose annual budget would be less than Suncor's daily, well, not Suncor right now, but less than the daily profit of an oil company would be able to take them down. This isn't about charities. This is about increasing public awareness of the risk posed by climate change and the demand for politicians to do something about it. So back to Vivian Krause. The question that we put to the commissioner early on is, if you're conducting interviews in secret, and we believe that he conducted an interview with Vivian Krause, and you intend to use that evidence to make negative findings about Alberta, or about Canadian charities, then you have to allow us to cross-examine that Vivian and test her evidence. So that's potentially how it could come back. Now, as far as I know, she's never had her position vetted in a judicial process. I don't think it would stand up at all. I think she's going to want to avoid that like crazy, just like the Alberta government would. So I'm not saying to anybody it will happen, but definitely it is something that we would seek to have happen if they intend to rely on it. Great question.
Yeah, and we don't know how this process is going to play out over the next few months, right? Like there's different forms that an inquiry could take, but like you say, the general idea would be that you put forward evidence and there's an opportunity to cross-examine on that evidence, right? And so if they're putting forward information that, you know, Ecojustice or anybody else who's involved would be able to ask questions to justify and to confirm the validity of that evidence. So, and again, like we don't know what this process may or may not look like, but we'll obviously be prepared and working with other environmental organizations who have, you know, looked to us for advice and maybe some guidance from the beginning of the process as to if this does come to a situation where, you know, people are having to give evidence or be cross-examined, what that'll look like, and making sure we're protecting their rights. So, okay. Next question here is, this is from Sophia, how is the Conservative press justifying the inquiry, or have they gone silent as the incompetence of the inquiry becomes more and more apparent? David, do you maybe want to take that question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, despite all the scandals this inquiry has subjected itself to, there's still some columnists out there that are writing columns in support and tweeting about their support. There's one columnist in Edmonton who basically just framed it as well, there's this anti-Alberta foreign-funded conspiracy out there. You know, we know that there is, and so this inquiry is just set up to get to the bottom of that. And I mean, you know, even that statement belies the biased, prejudged nature of the inquiry, because you know, it's taken at face value that there is this global conspiracy, and we're just trying to get to the bottom of it. And so, you know, that's false in and of itself, but the inquiry isn't even set up to, and doesn't even have the funding to even try to get to the bottom of the facts regarding this issue. So I think it's a real uphill battle that these columnists are having to justify the purpose and conduct of this inquiry in the face of all this negative press that it's I think rightfully generated.
You know, let me add one thing. Early on, we were getting interviews by Conservative press, and the thing that distinguished them from media that maybe were more balanced is the Conservative press never asked how we choose our work. They wanted to ask how we were funded, but they never asked how we would choose our work, and let it be implied that somehow the funders dictated what we worked on. It just doesn't work that way. And I think they don't want to ask that question because they don't want to hear the answer.
It doesn't fit the narrative. And I've seen, even just in the last few weeks and months, I have seen a change in how the media has been, conservative media has been reporting on this, where you have articles from traditionally conservative folks saying that this is a bad idea, like it just from an economic perspective, this is a waste of resources, and what is it actually going to show? So I've definitely noticed a change in tone and a lot of backtracking, I think, which I think is just in tune with the general vibe with the Kenney government over the last while, and how he's dealt with the pandemic. And there's just been a lot of pieces that keep coming into play, and it's just the layers are kind of coming in terms of, and the weight is building in terms of how Kenney, the government has been operating to date. So interesting to note how the media is responding to that. So I think this is a pretty interesting question. Interested to hear what your guys' thoughts are in terms of, so what happens, like what would the legal recourse or resources be available to individuals or organizations if there was an adverse finding in the inquiry's report about them or their involvement? What could they do?
Well, let me speak a bit, David, and this might flow into what you'd have to say, because you'll look at this more deeply. But so when Ecojustice decided to act in our name, that had the broader effect of, let's say, reducing the stress of individuals. But we were representing ourselves. We weren't necessarily representing them. So through every stage of the process, though, Ecojustice has tried to provide advice to the people that might be targeted by the inquiry so they can assess the risk and plan. So that's something David's doing in preparing the community if they are going to get called before the commission for these adverse finding things. And concurrently, we're also trying to find resources for people that might somehow be targeted by the inquiry. And I don't know, David, if you want to say any more about that work.
Yeah, I'll just say that the most of the process has been dreamed up by Commissioner Allen. So spending $100,000 commissioning these kind of junk science reports on climate change, and creating this process by which he posts those, and then he invites participants for response to get involved and provide their response on those reports that are inherently biased themselves. But the whole inquiry has been set up further to the Public Inquiries Act of Alberta, and so it still has to comply with that law. And that law requires, Section 13 of that law requires that if there's any adverse findings that are going to be made of an individual or an organization, they have to be notified, get a Section 13 notice, as we call it, be notified of the allegations and have a chance to respond to those allegations, at least with written submissions. And most public inquiries actually have public hearings. They have cross-examination of witnesses. None of that has been apparent here. It's all been done in secret. And it just brings me back to, I'm no student of history here, but in the 13th century, the Magna Carta was the first, real law in our British heritage for setting up due process. And due process has developed over the centuries to ensure that people have a due process, a legal way of protecting themselves. And this inquiry flies in the face of that, and I don't think it would stand up to muster even 100 years ago.
Let me just add one more piece on that. I mean, one of the first things we're going to have to answer for folks, or help them answer, is should they even respond at all? Because every indication is that the outcome is predetermined. You could argue that probably a lot of it's written based on publicly available information, particularly from Canada Revenue Agency about what donations were received and how they were used. So the effect they might want to have is distract people by having them engage, get the environmental communities at the hearing, because then they can't, they're distracted from their work. And we heard from several of the Canadian charities that believed they were going to be targeted. They were put off the game for a couple of months thinking, do we have to get lawyers? What do we do for a legal position? All that kind of stuff, when they should have been able to do their work. So probably, David has to figure this out, but probably the early advice that we'll have to give folks is whether they should worry at all.
Well, and that highlights the fact that from kind of day one, we've been, being a source of insight and advice for organizations who, like you say, unfortunately, this whole process, whether or not they participate, it ends up sucking a lot of energy and resources from environmental organizations, from the work that they should be doing, just to figure out what they have to do to protect themselves. And so it's an interesting process, and I don't know if that is the kind of the background goal or intent behind this whole issue, is just in the interim, whatever the findings may or may not be, it's distracting resources from organizations that would otherwise be advancing issues of environmental protection and social justice. So, but I think both your answers really highlight the fact that Ecojustice has been and continues to navigate this process and ensure that, whether a hearing actually takes place and what the report actually finds, that we will be ensuring that the rights of our organization and other individuals and groups within Alberta are protected, and that if there are adverse findings, we'll be assessing whether the process was legal and whether there are avenues for recourse after that fact. Like this, it doesn't end here, right? The process doesn't end after the hearing next week. We are going to be continued to engage for many months on this. So on that note, I wouldn't mind asking Devin if we could just circle back for folks, if they are interested in following along with the hearing next week, what's the best way for them to tune in and get more information?
Right. So we have learned that the hearing proceedings will be online, and maybe somebody knows yet. I know we'll be circulating the link to that, but I'm not, Melissa, I don't actually know the details of that. Maybe one of our colleagues knows. Are we asking for people to let us know if they want to have the link sent to them?
Yeah, it is. You know, in accordance with the court's view that these kinds of things should be public, and normally you could walk into the courthouse and watch it in the gallery. So there will be a WebEx link. There is a WebEx link. Now, if you're not a lawyer, you have to sign an undertaking that you won't be recording it or otherwise acting against the court rules. But the court has told us the justice hearing the case has reminded us of that open court principle, and members of the public are allowed to watch as long as they sign that undertaking.
David, do you know if the Alberta Court of Queen's Bench would put that link up as well? Because it's an electronic undertaking that then is emailed, right? So I think it's fairly straightforward.
Yeah, you know, this is all sort of new with COVID still, and I'm not sure how that works. I can look into that. I don't know if they post the links. I don't think they do post them on the website.
Anyway, we'll be trying to circulate the links to folks that are interested.
Great. Thank you both for your insightful responses to these questions and for the discussion. I think I'm going to turn it back to Carolyn now to close the event.
Thank you, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you, all three of you, for today's conversation. It was super informative and helpful. I've certainly learned a few new things today. I hope others on the call have also gotten a lot out of today's conversation. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I shared in the chat that we've recorded the webinar and we'll send you a link by email. We also had a couple of requests that we send out that we reshare the links that I dropped into the chat, so we'll do that as well. And as Devin mentioned, we'll be also sending out an update on the hearing next week. So keep your eye on your inboxes for those. And you've heard today about some of Ecojustice's work in Alberta, and that blog that we shared, David goes into a few more issues and cases that we have on the go right now. And then, as I mentioned at the outset, you know, Ecojustice has 5 offices across the country. And so we are working in other regions and sharing our expertise to ensure community groups, conservation organizations, Indigenous communities, and everyday Canadians on the front lines of the fight for environmental justice get their day in court and are heard by decision makers. And our team of experts, which includes lawyers and scientists, is backed by a large and growing community of supporters. And it's really all of us together. You know, we're all in this fight for a brighter environmental future. So it means a lot to us that you've joined us here today, and thank you for being so engaged on these issues. I wish everyone, you know, the rest of your day and your evening are wonderful, and that you stay safe and take care of one another. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us.